My name is Nick and I was very drunk yesterday.
Not as drunk as Nicholas.
Don't tell my mother about it. How are you guys doing? It's still like 80% of the crowd from yesterday, so that's pretty good. This keynote is about drinking, right? No. This time it's monolithic applications. So Rails is a web framework. It's pretty popular for building monolithic applications. What is a monolithic application? Right. Yes?
It's a big piece of crap nobody wants to maintain.
It's a big piece of crap. Why is it hard to maintain a big piece of crap? The problem, yeah?
Because there is many relationships between not related. There is many
Dependencies, we call it.
Yeah, dependencies between.
Right. There's a lot of dependencies. If you change a dependency in a monolithic system, then you might fuck up other parts without noticing it. I mean, Rails is a great framework. It gave us testing, and it made testing very popular in software development. I think, right, Steve?
Theoretically.
Theoretically, but it encourages you to build a monolithic application, meaning you have all your models, all your business logic, all your view logic in one application, and that's creating the kind of dependencies I'm talking about. And my problem with Rails was that there is no approach at all to build componentized applications. So I mean, Rails 3.0 improved the internal architecture, but we still have one big application to handle all our concerns in one system.
Sort of. So the one thing that Rails 3 did do that improves at this is the router. So the new router, you can mount any rack application under any URL. So one of the things that you're able to do, for example, is like mount a Sinatra app inside of Rails. So maybe you have api.mydomain.com. So you write your API in Sinatra, you put it into a class, and you put it somewhere in your application, and then you could mount that one on a specific part. So it's still like a little bit modularized. It's definitely not the same as having actual multiple apps and multiple repositories, but it helps. So I think that's a benefit too.
You can mount a Sinatra application in your Rails.
Yes, any rack application can be mounted to any URL inside the router.
Yeah, but if you mount a rack application, you still accessing models and stuff in the same.
Theoretically, but I'm saying you could separate it out via like folder, for example, right? So you have like all of your Sinatra stuff goes in this directory. It doesn't touch your Rails stuff, and that would be a little bit better. Yeah, it's not the same as a true modular application. I'm just saying that it can help.
It's still like in Rails, there is the concept of your protocol is the database, and everyone is like talking to each other Oh yeah, I love microphones. So in Rails, the entire application, the entire system is communicating on database level. So there is usually systems should be separated components, and they have to communicate using a protocol like REST or whatever, a SOAP. Don't kill me for that, but it's just some example of a protocol. But in Rails, it's like the communication happens on the database, and it's like if you want to access this part of the system, you have to use that kind of model, and you have to use this method. And that's my problem in Rails with. That's why I like REST and stuff, because if you build separated applications, and and they communicate using REST or SOAP or whatever, you have to think about interfaces and interfaces on a protocol level, not on the database level.
I definitely have seen people use a database when they should have used like 0MQ or like even a job queue, like people communicating with the database like it's some sort of locking structure. So
I feel pretty cool holding the microphone for you.
Yeah, I know. So
yeah, it's not true. Rails is not your problem. I think questioning how we define a monolith is important. We sort of equate monolith with poorly designed application. And it's not necessarily that. It might just be really big and it does a lot of things. But if you've broken encapsulation and the single responsibility principle, then it's not Rails that did it. And you can still do object-oriented programming without having to put all of your models in the database. You don't need to do that. So I don't think it's Rails. I think it's us.
We still have a culture of encouraging that, though. Is the problem. It's changing right now. Like what you are seeing in front of you is changing that culture away from that thing. But in the past, it has always been Rails generate scaffold, user or whatever. So
is the solution what GitHub supposedly does? Like dozens of small applications that communicate with each other, and then you can replace them like modules. With the radical approach is if it's over 100 lines, it should be a separate application.
Is it the rule of thumb, like 100 lines of code?
That's one of the rules, yeah. It's like, it's like the 6-line methods. Yeah. So is it, in practice, in your experience, is it more complicated to build small apps and combine them? Or is it actually, if you practice it enough, is it actually doable and maybe simpler in the long run?
DHH had this really great comment about, I know, sometimes he says amazing things. In this particular thing, somebody said, like, Rails is not good for beginners, and it used to be good for beginners. And he made a distinction between information that is learnable and information that is, I think, is like teachable or something. But the idea is that, like, there's a difference between it's easy to use because everything is all in one place, or it's easy to use because all of the components are easy to understand, and then you build them together. So, like, it depends on the way that you're looking at it. Like, if you have 50 100-line applications, each one of those is very simple to understand, sort of like your contexts in like a DCI application, but the connections between them get complicated. Somebody said, I forget who it was, there's a quote that, like, in a good object-oriented, probably Martin Fowler, in a good object-oriented code base, everything happens somewhere else. And, like, yeah, it's about small talk. And so that's sort of what happens. And so it's not that it's harder or easier, it's that it's a different style that you have to grow accustomed to. So I personally love, we write, with the code that we write in Ruby, most programmers would think that we have way too many methods and they're all too short, right? Like, people would say, oh, when I tell people, when I teach them that we try to shoot for 6-line methods in Ruby, they go, what? 6 lines? Like, I have multiple screens of, methods. So people sort of view our code that what we find easy to understand different in that same kind of way. So I think that you can easily learn how to manage tons of little apps, but it is different and takes practice.
I think you can start with Rails. I think Rails is fine for learning.
Just a note. So yesterday somebody told, like, the learning curve for Rails is very steep. But that's not true. Rails is pretty easy to learn.
I think it's because we know better and there's more information about designing properly done applications. We used to jam everything into your active record models, and if you wanted to store some data, it went into active record, or you needed behavior, well, you needed a database table behind it, and people would do stupid things like that. But there's a lot more information that we know better and how to do it in Ruby and Rails, and there's more example code, so there's a lot more to take in to understand how to do it properly. But you can still sort of get going and do it wrong and understand some things and find where the pain points are so that you can learn from that.
So I told you yesterday about that REST project where I slammed the door and just ran out, and this was one of the examples where we tried not to build a monolithic application but small systems. So we had like a products project and we had like a user project, and the cool thing was we were not talking in Ruby API methods, but we were talking like, hey, if you want to get a user, use this and this REST document, and you can use. So we were talking in REST API speak. And the cool thing was, if somebody from the products project fucked something up, it was like, hey, it's your fault because you're not returning what we expect. And if you have one monolithic application, it's pretty hard to blame people because it could be something completely different, which is fucking things up. And that's what I like about componentized applications, that you can blame people, because if they're not following the REST protocol, then they did something wrong. And that's what I like about componentized stuff.
I have 2 tiny sentences. Every time I try to build a Sutterer app, it fails and I rewrite it in Rails anyway. So I don't always like Rails, but it never fails. I always end up rewriting things in Rails, and I always regret using Sinatra as much as I like it. And every time I type git blame to find out what asshole did that thing, it is always me. So I just don't type it anymore.
Yeah. Should we?
Switch another topic.
Oh, that's so funny.
There was this idea of using presenters, so like better object-oriented way of doing views, and it's also somehow connected to the idea of backend frontend separation. So the frontend is a separate application, or is it just part of our main application? What do you think about that?
Can anybody explain presenter? What the fuck is NDE?
Draper.
Ah, okay, like a decorators?
Yeah.
Decorators.
A decorator that's for presentational display.
What is the difference between a decorator and a presenter?
A decorator that's for a presentational display.
Yeah,
Decorator
so
is a general pattern, and a presenter is a specific kind of decorator.
Yeah.
I mean, team Draper, so I have to know.
And like in DCI, when you add a role, you're decorating the object. You know, it's not presenter.
Yeah. So
presenter is like
a presenter is a decorator.
okay, but it's made for presenting.
Yeah, it's a specific kind of decorator.
But what is presenting? I mean, is it connected to human readable presentation?
Not necessarily. You can decorate an object to give it an XML presentation
What's the difference?
between.
Decorator and presenter.
It's with presentational versus behavior. DCI is behavioral change, which like I mean, you could call them all decorators and you would be correct. It's absolutely. You could call them all decorators and it would be correct. It's just some people have decided to make a subcategory called presenters. This is Avdi's object on Rails. Actually, I'm sure all of you have read it already since you just got it a couple hours ago. But he actually totally gets rid of decorators and presenters and comes up with a new name for these things because he doesn't like any of the terminology. So I'm not going to tell you because you should read it because you have a copy. So
Woo, surprise.
yeah, surprise. Anyway, you were trying to give an opinion before we sidetracked.
No, I'm just passing the mic back. Yeah, so I think it kind of depends how far you believe presenters or decorators or that E word that Avdi uses go, and whether again I don't want to go too fast to the whole idea of having data objects and the behavior separately. Maybe again presenters, which are the right way to do what we usually do with helpers, per class helpers, where we cram all the stuff that we use in our views. So presenters might be a good first step of splitting your domain objects into different parts and away from the data objects that are backed. Can you tell a couple of words about Draper?
Yeah, so Draper was created by Jeff, but since I work with Jeff, I basically do most of the maintenance on it now. Yeah, you missed my talk, so you don't know any of this. But I know it's okay. Anyway, so I'm a little biased because I maintain one of these libraries, and I do enjoy it. Draper specifically is very good if you're looking to do Rails view stuff. I will use Simple Delegator or some of the other stuff that was shown earlier in this conference if I'm not doing Rails view stuff, because Draper is primarily focused towards giving you the ability to use Rails view stuff, because that is complicated. Like if you want to add link to inside of your presentation, you need to like break into Rails and get where that's defined and like pull it out and make it available to use. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. And there are public APIs now, so it's not too terrible, but it's definitely a lot of metaprogramming. It took a couple iterations to get right. So what I really like about presenters and how I've started using them is essentially by making what other frameworks would call like a view model. So I really liked you're talking about forms and using forms via models. Like I think that's a very good idea generally. And so I've been like basically like every time a controller starts assigning more than 4 or 5 instance variables, I make it some sort of view model that represents the actual domain of the view. So
considered using cells.
I have considered using cells, yes, because it's sort of like that sometimes.
Why don't you use
Cells is more, because I feel like cells is really componentized. So like I often am not building websites that have like components that I want to reuse across multiple pages. So the example that we use for Draper is like an admin interface to the backside of your like app. So instead of like, I want all these different kinds of statistics. So instead of creating like 15 different kinds of statistics and assigning them all to instance variables in your controller, you make a dashboard object that is essentially a presenter. And then inside of that dashboard object, you write all the code that grabs the statistics. And then your view becomes very simple because you just print out dashboard.visits, dashboard.total hits count or whatever. Your controller is incredibly simple because it just says @dashboard equals new dashboard. And you're really testable because you have plain Ruby classes, basically.
And
So-
the visits method, how does it work? Is it rendering a partial?
No, it would just be like doing the calculation from the database to return the number, or whatever. Maybe rendering a partial. It's totally dependent.
It's rendering the widget on the dashboard.
Sometimes it would be the view, most of the time, I guess, and then sometimes it would be sometimes it would be partial. It really depends completely on exactly what you're doing.
But it's
Your answers should be cell.
Yeah,
yeah,
you should always use cells instead. It's
very
good.
detailed.
Yeah, I know.
I think I'm surprised often when a lot of people don't know where the instance variables come from in your views. I try to never use instance variables in my views. They're actually, when you initialize a controller instance to call some action and it has to render a view, it initializes action view and it copies over all the objects you have assigned in your instance
And the
variables.
helper methods and
If you
all that
do
stuff.
a view that says like, bracket percentage equals self.class and print it out, you'll be very surprised as to what it actually is. It's an anonymous class that has like 2,000 lines of stuff just like shoved into it.
So I always make a helper method inside my controller where I initialize like resource, for example. If you're using inherited resources, you can just use resource in your view. You don't have to do @resource or @blog or whatever it is. And that's a great way to dry up your views, and you can write a standard like index view that actually could be used elsewhere. So you can kind of move code around a lot easier if you're not using cells, without having to worry about the names of your instance variables. And your tests, you don't really have to care either. You just kind of mock out a method and return what you need for it.
Okay, Uncle Bob Martin was talking a lot recently about the idea of Rails is not your application. I think the same thing is connected to the idea of use cases, and I think it's similar to the way ACI things, so which you presented yesterday. So why don't you talk about that?
I did, yeah. Why don't you tell me what you thought about it?
I really liked your talk. It was energetic, funny, and you're a very charismatic speaker. Attractive, handsome. And hey guys, he's single. Yeah, so yeah, that's basically my opinion about you. We also had some kind of, so we were talking about the presenter stuff, but I also like to talk about the back and front end thing, just shortly. It's not really connected to presenters and technical, but I like the idea of having like a Rails or whatever back end and a completely separated front end, and they are communicating using REST or SOAP. And so there is a distinction. Sorry?
Wait for my talk. You will love it.
I hope I'll be there.
You will.
Because you must be some very charismatic speaker. And so when I gave a talk at the Uruko, the Shitty talk, and I presented the idea of having like a presentation front-end system application, completely separated from the back end. And there were lots of people like, okay, this is too complex, but there were also people like, wow, this is like the way REST systems are intended to be. And I'd like to hear opinions about that from my fellow speakers here.
Well, I mean, basically what we're talking about is doing good encapsulation and single responsibility principle applied to different applications over HTTP. So whether or not you do it inside your application and have done it properly with your modeling, or if you've done it as separate services because you need better scaling, it's sort of the same problem that you need to solve.
Yeah, I mean, like this is the way things are supposed to be. One of the constraints that was up on my screen was the layered system. So the idea is that you can introduce intermediaries that hide whatever comes from the back end. So you're essentially saying like, we should be adding a presentational layer that hides all of the previous implementation. You interact with it only through that, and that's a great way. Just like you build objects that use other objects internally, or like all the communication. Like you said, it's the same exact problem done via little applications as opposed to little classes. So totally.
Yeah, and I think one of the main advantages is that you really can think separately about the data in your application and the communication with the data. And when your presentation layer, even if it's the sole application that uses the API, whether it's REST or not, REST would be really cool, like the right kind of REST. But if your presentation layer is a separate application, it lets you design the stuff much better because you have to think how to design it properly. And it also eventually will make it much simpler if you want to come up with mobile application, if you want to have a native mobile application. You have all the stuff already available on a separate backend. And that is really, really cool in my opinion.
It's like interfaces. You have interfaces. So I like the interface part. So usually in Rails or in applications, people are talking in instance variables, and it's like, hey, if you want to use my data, XYZ, use this instance variable and this method from this model. And if you separate things, you have to define your interfaces using REST or whatever. And this is, somehow I like that because it's it forces you to write, to implement clean stuff, clean code, clean interfaces.
Another book I always tell everyone to buy, if you've not read now I'm totally drawing a blank on what it is. It's the book of Maintaining Legacy Code. That book is fantastic, and it boils down to a couple interesting things. Given our fishbowl talk earlier today, he defines legacy code as any code that is not currently under test. So, take from that what we will. But the vast majority of the book is about strategies for making your code testable. And he has this idea of a seam model. And so anywhere that you have a class boundary or a method boundary or something like a services boundary, you introduce a seam where you can place a test double that will enable you to test that area in isolation. So if you keep these seams under control or keep the area inside of them small, you're able to test these smaller units. And that's how that's what defines the components in your application, are these different seams. And oftentimes if something is hard to test, it's because you need to insert a seam somewhere to be able to wrap whatever thing it is that you're testing. And the rest of the book, which is like this thick, is all about the various different ways that you can insert these seams. And so, yeah, so it's really good. And it's the same thing, we were saying. Same problem, different form, I guess.
Okay, so now we can go to the Uncle Bob ideas and DCI use cases and or plain old Ruby objects.
You were talking about Bob, so
Yeah.
talk about it some more.
I don't like the Poro name. It's a plain old Ruby object, which for some reason is not about the basic object, but about the object. But so basic object, if you don't know, is what should be the plainest objects in Ruby. It's without all the niceties that Ruby gives you for every object. If you want to write anything like XML builder, then for example, I think that's the canonical example for using basic objects. It's when you want to strip the number of methods to the bare minimum. But what I think Uncle Bob said that should be picked up from his talk was that if you start designing stuff with Ruby objects rather than with the idea that these are models, active record, inherited stuff, then you can partition your system into parts that communicate with each other, and then, only then, you can actually think about how in practice make them live through restarts of your applications, for example, when it comes to persistence. And the way to architect or model systems, when you start with these ideas of basic Ruby objects that you test, you play with them, you think how they would be used by other parts of your system. If you start with that, then the designs end up being much more manageable in the long run, in my opinion.
Yeah, we were talking about this a really teeny bit at lunch, but one of the things that I've been thinking about during this conference is that most of the talks we've seen have been talking about mapping from one domain to another. So, separating your models from your persistence is about creating a mapping from your data layer to your model layer. And, your business models to Rails is all about creating a map between what Rails needs and what your business logic has in it. And then your APIs are all about mapping what your service is expecting to what other people are expecting. So we have all these different layers of mappings, and the problem is that in the past we've been trying to design systems such that those mappings don't exist. We expose our database tables to our models through Active Record, through our website, through our URLs, through our APIs. And that is basically makes it difficult because you're not, I don't like to say the real world because not to be too socialist, but the real world doesn't exist. You cannot model the real world in software. So one of the nice things about DCI is that a person plays different roles at different times in different contexts. And so the idea that you could represent a person as a person class and they're always a person is sort of not true. Sometimes there's some things, sometimes there are others, right? So right here, I am a presenter, but when I'm programming, I'm a programmer. And I don't think that one class is accurate to model these kinds of things.
Are you a decorator?
Yeah, I might be a decorator, maybe, possibly. So that's sort of the thing that I think is that it's about recognizing these separations between the different parts of our application and knowing when you need to actually separate them. So the nice thing about developing all plain Ruby objects is that you get to model your domain as accurately as possible without being worried about any of the mappings, and then you handle the mappings later, and that creates that boundary to do these kind of things elsewhere.
So just to continue what you said, so what I like when I program is I have a simple object, like a plain old Ruby object, and then I mix in some role, like you said, a presenter or whatever, or a programmer, and then I have a very limited object, and then I test this limited object in a limited test, and so I test all the edge cases and I test all the capabilities I mix into that object. And after I'm finished, so at some point I'm finished because I tested all the possible exceptions and stuff, and then I know this limited object is going to work under every condition. And this is what I love about the componentized stuff, like having a simple object, simple roles, simple capabilities. And after I'm finished with my tests, I can assure to everyone that this is going to work. And this is what I like about keeping things simple. And this is perfectly fitting with DCI, plain old Ruby object, and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think what's important about that focus is that you care more about behavior than you do other things. You can kind of wipe the stink of Active Record off of your application and focus. Nick is wrong. But you can just focus on the behavior. That's ultimately the only thing that you care about. Like Steve was saying, sometimes he's a programmer, other times he's a decorator, and he needs to behave in a different way. And if you're writing an application that talks about that behavior, then you really ought to focus only on that behavior. So using plain old Ruby objects, or what Rails calls them is just models, then that's the way to go. I always stress that app models is for modeling your domain. It's not for persistence. And there are some people who disagree and will add another directory for domain stuff. But app models is for anything that models behavior. Exactly.
Yeah, so that was from that Ruby Rogues podcast that I linked. Everything I know about Ruby and objects and Rails is from that podcast. And that the quote is from there, that I put all of my models in vendor plugins. But another quote that I absolutely love from there is from James Edward Gray II, who said that data in objects should be private, and it's behavior that exposes it, and it's behavior that's interesting, and the data is the kind of boring part that just makes the whole thing run, but it's exposed by behavior. So objects as data and behavior, the behavior is the part that is interesting, and DCI nicely shows this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think one of the points in DCI is that, in pretty much any definition of object-oriented programming, we talk about objects being the encapsulation of data and then the functions that they perform, but it doesn't say when that has to happen. You don't have to make a class that defines all of those functions from the start. So DCI just kind of adds it when you need it, And it makes a whole lot more sense. You still are dealing with object-oriented programming. You still encapsulate data and the functions that are required to perform an algorithm, but you just put it in as late as possible.
I like to make analogies and bring in comparisons from other domains often. So if you look at from real life sometimes, but this is still computer related. So like if you talk to computer security people, right, one of the first things that they do, it happens. One of the first things, I mean, you should never talk to the computer security, but if theoretically you're required to talk to the computer security people, they will talk about the attack surface of your application. So like, what are all the public things that you expose? Because those are the vectors that people can break your stuff. So if you think about your objects from this like attack surface perspective, Active Record is terrible because it adds like 150 methods to your class's public interface, including method missing and all that stuff. So if you're trying to like understand an object, you call like, there's no point in calling like model.methods, because you can't even see your domain methods mixed into the hundreds of methods that are added by the rest of Rails.
Try pack completion in Rails console.
Yeah, it's like, it takes forever because there's a million methods. So that's one of the problems you should be thinking about. And one of the nice things about this like idea of limited objects and mixing behavior in only at some times is that you minimize the amount of public interface that your objects have, which is good for encapsulation and also good for like you're saying testing. You can test all the edge cases when you know this object has 5 public methods, not 100 and whatever, because even if you don't call all those Active Records methods, they're still exposed and maybe you'll accidentally call them or some of your other code or something won't happen like that. So
yeah, I just want to throw out that the mass assignment problem can sort of be solved with looking at things through DCI classes. You have a context in which you need to update this information in the database. And if you can only update it at that point, then you can protect it at that point. So it doesn't necessarily, I know Yehuda added his suggestion for adding something to the controllers, but which is a fine place for it, but I sort of see a way of just putting it into an object that actually controls that. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in Rails we have like 3 layers of abstraction. We have like the model, then we have the controller, and we have one view. And I wonder, so we mix in everything into the model. That's the place where you do your stuff. And I wonder why did that happen like that? I mean, Rails started as a web framework, and it's evolving, but we still have those 3 levels of abstraction, and that's why is it that limited? Why are people so scared about adding new abstraction layers, like the form object, for example? Why did that happen? I'm not sure about that, and maybe you could tell me.
I heard you are a Rails contributor. Yeah, I'm now a Rails contributor. I got my first patch in Rails last week. So that was fun. Thank you. So if you look at the history of where Rails came from, it was mostly very basic CRUD apps. So if you talk to like Obi Fernandez, he'll talk about when he was doing work, at a company, and I think it was John Deere actually, and he built this like internal reporting application, and he was using the very earliest builds of Rails, and he built it in something like 2 days, and all it needed to be was CRUD with some models that grabbed some data from a database and spit it out in a nice report format, and everyone he was working with went, "How long did it take you to build this?" And he was like, "A day," and they were like, "I can't even believe that you did that," because in 2006 that was true. So Rails came out of using these kinds of applications that were very simple, CRUD-based, throw some information with a database on a web page, because in 2005 and 2006, like those were the web applications that we were building. So in some ways, we sort of taken this like idea of 2005 ways of building applications and taken it to its logical extreme without ever breaking out and thinking about different ways of building these applications. So whenever, as much as we like to make fun of Java people, for example, whenever some Java people saw some of my blog posts about like plain old Ruby objects, they were like, "Oh, we've been doing that stuff for years. We call that a PDO, man. Like, we knew this answer in 2000. You make fun of us all the time? Well, like, suck it." And so, like, it's totally true. Like, we are sort of reinventing right now all of these conversations. People from other languages would laugh at us for not knowing these kinds of things. They do, but it's behind our backs because we don't pay attention to any other communities, except to make fun of them. And so that's one of the things that's like very difficult is, and a lot of people are new to programming or they're new to web stuff, and like Rails has brought them up, and so they sort of learned in this tradition. And so like it comes from, it makes sense from where Rails came from, and Rails, I don't know if Rails is going to be able to change enough with because you know, the core team tends to like to build those kinds of applications still. I mean, like, what is Basecamp, right? Like, Basecamp Next is still very basic CRUD with some pretty JavaScript on top. Not that that's not incredibly valuable to millions of people, but like, that's the kind of application it is, and that's the kind of application that you expect to build with Rails. So.
Can I just quickly show AOP? Or yeah, if you can show me a browser, because there's no way you can explain it in an infinite number of ways. Okay, so AOP is the thing that I totally forgot to show in my presentation, which I feel guilty about ever since. But I can show. Okay, so I will. So Andre will tell you what AOP is, and I will show you it.
AOP is about adding non-functional requirements to your domain objects. So the idea is that you can intercept method calls and do something at the same time. So you can intercept a method call to an object, do some stuff before this method call, after this method call, or instead of this method call. And there are some examples like logging or tracing that perfectly show the idea of AOP. And I think AOP is something that is missing in our community. Not so many people talk about it, and I think it'll be very useful to learn about AOP. Yeah, it's also from Java, yeah. And stop hating Java.
Then we can use it.
So basically what I wanted to show is that logging might not necessarily be the responsibility of your object, and yet you often want to know what the fuck happens in your application. So, for example, there's a very simple error capture library, and you can say, like, for every, there's the 56 line, for every object that is a generator, capture before the method blankets, and just put a debug statement. We got here with those arguments, and something, something, something. Or this, after the method run finishes, say how much time did it take, even though it happened. So this is the prime example of something happening somewhere else. This is basically how, when I was working on my PhD and I really needed to procrastinate, I split the whole logging stuff into a separate class, and the whole logging happened somewhere else. And so this is it.
Thanks. We now have some time for questions, not a lot of time, but if you have any question, yes.
Is there an example of web application quite scientific with use of this technique to just review as like a learning group or stuff like this?
The question was if there is any example application that shows the techniques that we discussed.
All of them. Nobody really like open sources websites is one of the big problems. So like even just finding a good Rails app to like show someone how a Rails app is built, like how many Rails apps can you name that are like actually open source? Like you know, other than the ones that I have personally, I don't know of any that are. Yeah, Twitter. Yeah.
I'll say that I'm actually planning on rewriting Radiant CMS. It's yeah, I want to use ideas from DCI in it. For me, it was a great it was a great way to learn about metaprogramming, because Radiant sort of forces you to take all of your different concerns and push them into different extensions and whatnot. But it's on Rails 2, and there's a lot of messy code in there. So eventually, that I hope to be able to do that. Although rubypair.org, I think, is an open source application on GitHub where they're trying to do the same types of things. Evan Light created that, and he will even pair with you on rubypair to try these things out. So that would be a place that I would go.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
There is some danger when instead of writing a monolithic app, we do a lot of small applications, because those applications have their dependencies, and it could very easily end up doing like 5 applications, when for one action in one app you need to make call to another, and then call to another, and then you end up with like tens of cycling API calls between those applications, and that's really hard to maintain, that's really hard to understand, and it's damn slow.
if that happens, that's a design problem. That means that your API and your data is designed the wrong way.
Thank you. Yeah, that's true. So if you figure out, so of course it in the beginning, if you start to split up your application into smaller systems, that it seems to be more complex, and I often fail and then I figure out, shit, I have to call 5 different services for one domain issue. Yeah, and then I have to like I have to figure that I designed my API wrong.
Your APIs should be exposing workflows, not data. So if you're making like 5 API calls, that means that you're like exposing like functions that are giving you data back that you're doing processing. And so you should be exposing the workflow that gives you the information that you want, instead of like calling procedural methods, RPC stuff, and getting lots of data. So that's
so maybe your services should also follow the tell don't ask principle.
Yeah, that's a good way.
So we had exactly that kind of stuff in my last project. We had like I think it was like an order, and then we had a product, and then we need some client and stuff, and we had to address 3 different services, and then we were like, oh man, that sucks. And what we did is just we added a workflow. We actually called it workflow. It was a workflow service which encapsulated that kind of behavior. So there was no 3 calls to the API, but 1. So we had to redesign the API, and this is, redesigning, refactoring, this is agile, this is cool, you know?
I think you should really only try to make a separate service application when the idea or the process is mature. If you start out with something that you're not really sure how it's going to work, and then you realize you've totally done it wrong, then you have another problem. You have to implement it correctly, but you have to go fix all the different applications and maybe combine them back into one. I think you should write code that allows you to turn like a database call into a service call. And doing something like DCI allows you to just say, well, I don't care where this is coming from, I only care about behavior, or whatever it is. You know, if you take a context and that becomes a service application, that's one way of looking at it too. But you can start out with database.
If you have, let's say, this encapsulated workflow service, and you do just 1 call to this API, in the backend it still does like 5 calls to other services.
Cache.
Sometimes, yeah. It all depends on the requirements. Like this is a very general question, right? So oftentimes people, you need to pay really close attention to caching and the way that you expose the data so that the caching makes sense. Like if you're exposing your data in a way that it invalidates your cache all the time, then that can be a problem. So you need to sort of like figure out the appropriate way to be able to cache data. I mean, that's primarily the way that I get rid of API calls. The fastest API call is one that doesn't even need to travel over the network. So, so that's, historically, I have not had that particular problem based on the things that I have done. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but that's usually my answer is you need to rethink how your caching works. So.
And if you to come back to your example, if you figure out that your workflow service is still doing 3 calls to client, product, and catalog or whatever, so maybe you have to refactor your database stuff. So you have to pull in the databases. So you have to you have to build dependencies. So you have to pull your tables into that service, because if you figure out that service is addressing the users and the products all the time, then maybe you have to rethink your applications. So it's like if you figure out you're calling methods on some object, and then you usually refactor that object so you use it directly in the user object, and that's the same with databases. If you figure out, okay, I'm using that service all the time, then maybe the service should be in that user service, in the client service as well. So you have to reshape your application.
Okay, so the last question.
They all have this great idea, but they all seem to go against the Rails way, the old school Rails way. So is Rails really a framework to apply these patterns, or maybe just a time to try maybe just another framework?
I'm in a very love-hate relationship with Rails. I will sometimes tell you it's the best thing ever and sometimes tell you it's the worst. The problem, the tricky thing about Rails is that it gives you so much stuff that's so damn convenient that using other frameworks is hard sometimes. People, we do a pretty decent job of releasing most gems as like rack stuff so that you can use them with other frameworks. But like I was saying about Sinatra earlier, like every time I try to use Sinatra, I end up rebuilding 3/4 of Rails every single time. So, and Rails does, just because we have the Rails way and it is opinionated does not mean that we can't change our opinions later, and it doesn't mean that it still gives you the flexibility, especially after the 3.0 stuff. You have the flexibility to sort of do whatever you want within reason, and so I still think that it's not good, but it's still the best thing that we actually have, basically.
So I have the thing. So there's a thing that everybody says that you can't do distributed applications in Rails, and I think that's bullshit because Rails is really good HTTP support, and you don't have to even include action view. And the thing that it says that is in on your hard drive and stacks, I don't know, like half of the megabyte, and it's doesn't mean that you have to include it. And also the thing that's about race working, that people in race working are rather for building these monolithic apps like old style. It's something weird because there's like 10 people working on something like that, and like probably guys from for example Signals or a few other guys have this concept of building applications like that, but there are people who want to push that to some API like applications or something like that. So I don't agree that that you have to take Rails and all of this stuff. You can just take action pack and just use like the controllers with HTTP support. So
I think David counts as 20 contributors. Like, you know what I mean? Like his opinion is the final say. Like he vetoes it. So the decent exposure, the helper stuff. Like for example, that Jim was talking about. There's a gem called decent exposure that helps manage this for you. And DHH says like I don't care that views are terrible and they mix in thousands of stuff. I like the fact that I can be lazy and just use instance variables. So it's never going to change because DHH said so. So like even if there are people that are trying to change it, but like look what happened to Yehuda, right? Like he left for JavaScript because he got sick of taking crap from people about the Rails framework.
Well, I don't know. You might be putting words in his mouth.
I might be putting words in his mouth, but from my perspective, that's what I
say. I think what DHH says about the views and using instance variables is actually good. I think it's fine that they're there. I think it kind of flattens out needing to require that you do all this setup. You know, when you get into a controller and you just set an instance variable and it's available in the view, it's totally magical and it's fantastic. You can get going and you don't really need this deep structure and a lot of setup. I think having something like decent exposure as an option would be a good idea, but you know.
I said that in your talk yesterday, which was a very good talk, by the way. Yeah, you're a very charismatic speaker, very handsome. But you're not single. I said, so you were talking about the future of Rails, and I said, if Rails gets even more modular, then it's still my framework of choice, because a framework should be very modular. And if you have optional stuff like decent exposure, then it's like the perfect way to go. So if Rails continues to develop as it did in the last, let's say, 2 years, then we should use it. We should keep using it.
I'm done talking.
Yeah, so no, I think what Draper said was basically very true, that you can do all of this in Rails. You just have to think of it. And you not necessarily need to use all of Rails every time, exactly how the 10-minute blog demo was showing.
There was a question that perhaps it's not the Rails way, or perhaps we need some other framework. So it's not about framework, it's about our application. And this application should be, I mean, use cases, those business objects, they should be framework independent anyway. The framework is something that we should build upon, but isolate from. Those frameworks should be on the boundaries of the system. So we can perhaps change it in the future, like change backend
So thank you for the discussion.